A similar vein here is the mouse and touchpad settings here. Let me just drag this window up a little bit higher there. So if you're a lefty and the world is backwards, you can change your left-handed mouse buttons to be inverted. So your left click would be the right click, and the right click would be the left click. All you have to do is just toggle that on, and then that's just a simple change there. You can reverse scroll direction if you prefer for up to be down and down to be up with the scroll. You can turn that on. Show pointer or show position of pointer when the control key is pressed. So that could be helpful if you lose track of your mouse pointer sometimes. You can do that when you press the control key. It'll like flash a little bit and it'll show you where it is if you turn that on. It says emulate a middle click by clicking both left and right buttons. So if your mouse does not have a middle mouse button, or even if it does, you can still have it perform a middle click if you click both left and right mouse buttons at the same time. And by default, that feature and that behavior is turned on. So it will do that regardless, unless you tell it not to by turning it off. That'd be the thing there. So it says drag and drop threshold in pixels is 8 pixels wide. So if you want to change the leeway that it gives you when you're trying to drag and drop something onto something else, you can change the size of that. So if you wanted to get more specific, you can make it 5 pixels wide or really precise, whatever. But generally there's not much need to change that setting, I don't think, unless you have a strong preference one way or the other. So here you can change the pointer size and the speed. So by default it's here. If you want to make it a little bit larger so it's easier to spot, you can. And you can see the mouse cursor got a little bigger. You can make it even larger, and it got a little bigger. So it's helpful to especially if especially with higher resolutions and things, everything just seems to shrink in size. So you may find that useful at higher resolutions, especially to make your mouse cursor a little bit larger if you if you have trouble finding it, or those sorts of things, and you don't want to lose track of it as much. You can change the size. Custom acceleration and sensitivity, if you turn these on, they both have little sliders here that show up, and then you can change that. Sensitivity is high, so the lower you set the sensitivity, the sloppier it moves around, I guess you could say. It doesn't track as easily or as accurately to what your movements are. But the acceleration here, you can change that. If you don't want your mouse to move so slow, like I was like, I want it to go faster, you can do that, customize it manually, or you can just set the defaults and it will do that as well. If you like the defaults and that's comfortable for you, you can do that. Leave them at the defaults without having to customize it. But if you do want to change it, that's how you do it. A combination of faster speed and lower sensitivity usually makes it move a little bit faster overall, but you may want a higher sensitivity just for accuracy of the movement as well, because there's a point where you'll like overshoot what you're trying to aim at with your mouse and things like that, with the sensitivity too low. But you can play around with it to suit whatever your preferences are for your device. And then you can also change the double click time. So in the double click test here, so if I click once and I click again, it did nothing because that was too long. But if I double click a little bit faster, like click, and it says success. So you can test if you want it to be longer. You can do double click, and then that time it worked, even with the longer period of time. At the longest, you could do single click, double click, and it would still, succeed. So just whatever you feel is comfortable for your own double clicking speed. You can make it shorter time if you want it to go fast and only fast, or you could, set it to somewhere in the middle to have it be a reasonable amount of leeway between that, between the first click and the second click before it registers as a double click. And then on the touchpad tab over here, especially if you're on a laptop, this is what this will apply. You can enable or disable the touchpad. So if you are on a laptop and you don't want to use the touchpad and you just want to use the mouse that you have hooked up to it, you can just turn that off entirely. But by default, it's there. and enabled. Even if you're on a desktop and you don't have a touchpad, it's still enabled by default. Because it's a basic functionality sort of. It's like saying enable mouse. It's like, yeah, you're going to need a mouse. So they assume you don't have a touchpad, or they assume you don't have a mouse, and that maybe all you have is a touchpad to use, and so it's on by default. And then settings related to it, tap to click. So you can tap the touchpad to simulate a left mouse button click, and that's on by default. So disable touchpad when a mouse is attached. That's off by default, so you can still use a touchpad even if you have a mouse. But if you want it to work that way, to where whenever you have a mouse hooked up to your computer, that you don't want to use the touchpad at all, then you can turn that on, and it will do that way. There's an option for disabling touchpad while typing. By default, that's on. You can turn that off if you want to be able to type and also use the touchpad at the same time. I struggle to think of a time when that would be useful, so I usually just leave it to the default setting there. Because usually when you're typing, your hands are busy typing, not using a touchpad. But maybe there's if you do have a need for it, you can turn it off. So the quick actions are automatic by default. Otherwise, you can say left click only, emulate mouse buttons, or use multiple fingers for right and middle click. I think automatic is kind of like emulate the mouse buttons in that sort of way, but I'm not 100% sure there. Let me see if it gives me any guidance here in the tooltip or anything. It doesn't look like it does for this one, but I usually just leave it to automatic, and I haven't had too much trouble with that. But if you are looking for a specific behavior with your clicking, you can set those here for the touchpad options here. The scrolling behavior here for the touchpad, it says reverse scrolling direction. So that's on by default actually, and that's for touchpad. That's a little bit intuitive, I feel like, to have it that way. But so as you pull your finger down to scroll, it will scroll the page up, and if you move your finger up the touchpad to scroll, it will move the page down on the screen. So that's the default behavior. But if you don't like it that way, if you want it to work the other way, you can just simply turn that off here. Scrolling method is set to automatic. Otherwise, you can do no scrolling, so you could disable scrolling completely on your touchpad if you don't like to scroll on the touchpad. Otherwise, it'll be two fingers to scroll, or edge scrolling. So on the edge of the touchpad, it'll let you scroll. Automatic is just, I believe, I want to say it's like two finger scrolling, I think, but I'm not too sure, if there's other settings to it or not. But horizontal scrolling is disabled by default, but if you would like to enable that, you can, and that would allow you to scroll left to right as well as up to down, up and down like you normally can for vertical scrolling. Pointer speed, again, custom acceleration and sensitivity settings, just like on the mouse side, except this is for the touchpad pointer speed itself. So if you need or want to customize that, you can right there. Next is the network settings. I actually won't go into that, but it's how you control your home networks and your your Wi-Fi, internet, things like that. If you need to change your connection, add a connection, modify settings for it, that's all here in the network section. Power management is generally going to be most useful for laptops, but there's also some settings even for a desktop computer. So in the power options here, it says turn off the screen when inactive for 30 minutes. So that's by default, and the screen itself will just shut down if you aren't using it. And suspend when inactive for never. So that's the default setting, but you could also set it to any of these that you choose if you want to have it suspend. And likewise for turn off the screen, maybe you never want it to turn off the screen, but you want it to suspend or whatever. You can modify that to your liking there. And it says extra options section. It says when the power button is pressed, ask. So you have other options here. You could either lock the screen, suspend it, shut down immediately, or do nothing. But by default, it will ask you, like, you press the power button, what do you want to do here? And if you were on a laptop, you would get additional settings here for related to your battery settings. the power options related to that. So like what you wanted to do when it's on battery power, things like that. Since I'm not on a laptop currently, that's not showing up, but this is the section where all those sorts of things would appear. If you enjoyed this video and you want to learn even more, you can find my books at bookstoread.com/Jonathan. That's books, the number 2, read.com/JONATHAN.